Okay, so hopefully you watched the video on what is conservatism, so you know what conservatism is. So, does everyone who calls themselves a conservative, are they cool with each other? Do they chill with each other? Do they go around each other's houses? As we're going to see, not always the case. Okay, first off, what do they agree about? We could say all conservatives agree on. Well, even this is contentious, but I'm going to throw some things out there. I think that they all believe that human nature is really fixed and is usually a little bit negative. I put usually in italics there because it's not always the case. Most conservatives reject utopian ideologies, by which I mean socialism, some forms of liberalism, anything that promises you a better world. They argue that human aggression and greed are fixed and make these things very, very impossible. Almost all support traditions and traditional values. Okay, so we talked in the last video about family values and traditional institutions. Most conservatives support them. It's only at the extremes generally in the real world where you find that they don't. And all conservatives support private property and free enterprise. Okay, so let's have a look at the different branches. We're going to start with traditional conservatism, the oldest type. In the corner there is Thomas Hobbes, one of our thinkers, and Thomas Hobbes was inspired, sort of reacting to the English Civil War. Okay, the war of people wearing a certain type of hat against some different people wearing another type of hat. So what did they come out with? Well, Thomas Hobbes was kind of scarred by the English Civil War. I think when he was a young man, he overheard a beheading or something. I can't quite remember what it was, but he basically was a horror at it, and he said change should be slow and pragmatic. What he said was that we had to submit to authority. We shouldn't try and do these revolutionary changes, and that society is organic and it's held together with bonds of tradition and duty, and you shouldn't disturb those by trying to implement new revolutionary things. He came up with this idea that he was the first to articulate really that people have different abilities and talents, and to make them all unequal is unnatural. So he kind of refuted any revolutionary talk, and those at the best were a best place to make decisions on behalf of everyone. Okay, so he supported kind of hard, soft and hard paternalism, like we saw in the last video. Next we move on to One Nation conservatives. So that is Benjamin Disraeli in the corner, and Disraeli was also inspired by revolution, but the Industrial Revolution. So he looked at the inequality that was happening in the Industrial Revolution, and he was worried that Britain would split into two nations. And again, the threat of revolution kind of stalked his ideas. So he said, we need to do the following things. He said that those who are more fortunate, that if those who are not more fortunate do not take responsibility for those below, then they will face this threat of revolution, and certainly socialism was a threat when he was in Prime Minister. But also he argued that it's morally the right thing to do, so he thinks that people should look after those below them. He argued that we should maintain traditional institutions, particularly ones that were good for the nation. So he was very concerned with this idea of the nation and maintaining it. He installed some reforms for the working class. He even gave them the vote with the 1867 Reform Act. This basically gave the franchise to men who had some property. You had to have something. You couldn't just have nothing. But it was much less than it used to be, which used to have to have a lot of land. One Nation conservatism didn't just stay in the Victorian period, though. It kind of it went on, and actually One Nation conservatives supported the mixed economy after the war, so that's kind of a nationalised industry with some private property as well. And it's also been endorsed as an ideology by Cameron and May. So Cameron called it compassionate conservatism, and Theresa May, oh gosh, had some speech when she first became PM where she said, we're going to run Britain for the oh gosh, I can't remember what it was. Anyway, you get the gist. Okay, the last one, and the last it's quite different branch is the New Right. Okay, so One Nation and traditional conservatism share lots of beliefs. The New Right can be quite different. So the greatest proponent is Margaret Thatcher, but she was in turn organised or sort of influenced by this movement called the New Right, which started to gain ground in the 1970s. So what they were against the kind of permissiveness of the 60s. Okay, so people breaking down barriers, sexual liberation, experimenting with music, and all of those kind of things. Pretty much everyone in that photograph is not to your to the Conservatives' cup of tea, really. Okay, so but what do they actually believe? Well, so they, like I said, they arose in the 1970s. But they also arose in reaction to the failure of Keynesian economics to deal with stagflation. So that is when you get inflation and unemployment at the same time. So, and Keynesian economics, this kind of mixed economy, couldn't really deal with that. So they had a belief about the economy as well, which is monetarism, which we'll talk about later. It's made up of two seemingly contradictory parts. So it's made up of neoliberalism and neoconservatism. So neoliberalism is basically not getting involved in the economy. The government doesn't get involved in the economy at all, or as little as possible. And neoconservatism is the social side of things. So that's like social policies. Okay, so more conservative social policies, so like anti-gay marriage, that kind of thing. Okay, so really, they propose radical changes, to the economy, but with a sort of reactionary flavour of these quite conservative policies as well. Okay, so let's look a little bit deeper into what neoliberalism is. Okay, so neoliberalism, and this is what Thatcher did. So she made a tight control of the money supply. So all of her economic policies were to control inflation. And she also wanted to get the state out of the economy as much as possible. If you remember, lots of the economy was in state hands, British Gas, British Rail, etc. So on the grounds of efficiency and competition, she says, let's privatise it. She deregulated lots of things, so she removed regulations and let the forces of the market unleash, particularly in the City of London, something called the Big Bang. And the neoconservative policies that she had were, she had these defense of family and family values. Okay, so big on families, and that's true of conservatives today. Actually, even the Conservative government since 2015 has given lots of tax breaks to families, etc., etc. Okay, Margaret Thatcher had strong law and order policies, and that continues with Conservatives today. They're always talking about law and order. Opposition to permissiveness. Section 28 was when they banned the teaching of homosexuality in schools and any other public institution, actually, so that applied to councils and stuff as well. No, you weren't allowed to promote it, sorry. So all in all, what that meant was they were quite conservative social policies. So you can see that they're very liberal when it comes to the economy, and quite conservative when it comes to social stuff. Okay. Oh yeah, and the one last thing that they did: determination to protect morality. So they protected video market. So you know the video, the 18, the 15, all that kind of stuff that you get on DVDs now. That comes from Margaret Thatcher. So they wanted to protect the public from video nasties. Okay, let's go through the thinkers, and then we're going to go through a couple of essays. So Hobbes. Hobbes is the first Conservatives, as you can see, compared to the rest of our thinkers. He's born quite early. What does he think? He so in his book Leviathan, which refers to like a big, powerful creature, which for him was the state. Okay, he argues that humans should submit all of their natural rights, except one right, which is the right to self-defense, to a powerful state, or risk returning to a state of nature. So for Hobbes, a state of nature was a hypothetical place before kind of civilization and government, where basically man was at war with every other man. So he described it as a war of all against all, and he feared that in the state of nature, life would be pretty rubbish. We'd all be killing each other, smashing it over the head. And in fact, his quote was, "Life would be nasty, brutish, and short. Should we be left to that?" So he said, humans naturally They're averse to living in that state, and therefore they will exchange their rights in return for security. He also argued that human capacity for reason is limited and usually guided to a large extent by our selfish urges. Again, arguing to submit to that sort of larger authority and not trust our own instincts too much. Therefore, our best hope of a peaceful life is obedience to strong authority. That could be a king, or it could be a government, etc. Okay, how do we use this in our essay? So he's a good example of a traditional conservative, and he gives us the philosophical underpinnings of why we should accept government and strict law and order. Okay, so he sort of outlines why we should do that. Okay, our next thinker is Edmund Burke. You can see we come about 100 years or so after Hobbes. He is an Irishman, he's a statesman, and he's a philosopher. He looked upon the French Revolution in horror, and he argued that it showed us a few eternal truths about man and politics. One is that attempts to implement change on society based on abstract principles like freedom and fraternity and equality of the French Revolution, rather than the accumulated wisdom of the past, were likely to fail. Okay, so he was very much against revolutionary change. He argues for an organic society in which we should follow our natural selves and natural order. Basically, he argues for tradition and this other thing called empiricism, which is where you kind of look at what works, look at the evidence, and then use your move forward from there. Okay. He also argued that a nation needed a strong sense of identity, and that would come from following traditions. How to use him? Well, actually, again, he's a good example of a traditional conservative, in particular when you're trying to make the point about using either pragmatism or organic society, so that conservatives dislike revolutionary change. Now, he is kind of a bridge. Actually, you could use him as a one nation as well. He didn't use the word one nation; that was coined a bit of time later. In that he really supports the organic society, but otherwise he's a traditional conservative. Okay, next one is Michael Oakeshott. He is a one nation conservative. In rationalism in politics and on human conduct, he argues that actions should be guided by pragmatism. But why, Michael? Well, he was responding to the brutal fascist and communist regimes of the 20th century. So you think we've had Hitler, Stalin, Mao, etc. And he argues that rationalist ideology leads to tyranny, i.e., if you think you've rationally thought of the best way to organise human society, according to Oakeshott, because humans are limited, you're almost certainly wrong, and your conviction that you are right will probably lead you to doing some nasty things. Okay. In contrast, a pragmatic, i.e. a step-by-step approach, offers flexibility, a connection to the past, and cohesion while still delivering what people want. So you can still deliver change, but you do it slowly. Okay, how to use Oakeshott. So he's a good example of traditional and one-national conservatives. He emphasises moderation and pragmatism and argues why they're so important, but in a more modern context than Burke. Okay, so he talks about the mixed economy and stuff like that. So he's more of towards a one-nation conservative. Okay, next we have Ayn Rand. Now she also, in a way, is responding to fascism and socialism. I think she's originally from Russia. But she moves to America and writes novels, and she writes her philosophy called Objectivism. And Objectivism argues that people are rational and should pursue their own happiness. Okay, so that's basically people are kind of like ends, I suppose. And so people need to be free to use their rationality and work hard to be productive and self-respecting. So people kind of need to be left alone in a sense. But her sense of being left alone is quite radical. Okay, Welfare should be rejected on the basis that it requires taxation, which is ultimately forced. So ultimately you are forcing someone to pay tax for someone else's welfare. She didn't like that. But moreover, and this is what makes Ayn Rand quite radical, is that altruism. And altruism is when we do good things for other people, should be rejected because it creates an artificial sense of obligation. She thinks we are all individuals, we are all rational, and to even try and help someone, let alone try and tax them, is a morally bad thing. Okay, how to use her? Well, she's a good example of a radical libertarian. Okay, so she puts the individual above everything else. She thought that capitalism was a moral good, as it allowed people to pursue their rational ends better than any other system. Okay, she also believed in the individual, and she rejected the idea of organic society in any sort of social obligation. Okay, so for her, welfare is right out. Okay, last thinker is Robert Nozick. He died more recently, and he is very influential in actually creating the new right. Okay, so in Anarchy, State and Utopia, he argues the following. He's quite similar to Rand, really, but he argues that people cannot be treated as means. Okay, they are ends in themselves, so he's a bit like Kant in that way. He argues that individuals, if you follow this line of reasoning, individuals own their own bodies, talents, and labour. So he agrees with Rand on taxation, and he amounts to slavery in that you're using one person's labour to pay for another person's welfare. He doesn't like that. He argues that the state basically can force someone to pay tax, and therefore it's wrong. He argued that only a night watchman state should be allowed to protect against violence, theft, and fraud, and those are the only things it should exist for. Okay, how do we use him? Again, he's a good example of a radical libertarian, particularly in the economic sphere. In its philosophical approach, the individual means that he is opposed to any state intervention, including soft paternalism, and is quite radical, i.e. non-pragmatic in his ideas. So he doesn't, if he was given the helm of government, he wouldn't be pragmatic about it. He would make some pretty large changes. Okay, now you've got all the informations. Let's go through a couple of essay plans, all right? So, conservatives and the state. This is one of the questions you might get. First of all, what do they agree on? Remember in your essays to always put down what they agree on. Okay, so areas of agreement are they all support the state in some form. Okay, they're not anarchists, so they do all support the state. They all believe the state is important to ensure property rights. Every conservative believes that. They all believe the state needs to be tough on law and order. And in practice, most governments who call themselves conservative use the state to protect traditions and traditional family values. Okay, so they are all areas of agreement of the state. Okay, so where do they disagree? Well, One Nation traditional conservatives, they revere the state as a body of accumulated wisdom. Okay, so remember that our parliamentary institutions, all of those kind of things have grown up over time because they're there. That proves that they're good. They kind of say we should revere the state in some way. They believe it should be obeyed almost no matter what, particularly traditional conservatives. And that is going back one. That is because they believe that in the state of nature and Hobbes, and that if we don't have an authority, we're all going to kill each other. They believe it should be used to further One Nation principles. So that's hard and soft paternalism. So all in all, you could use Hobbes for this. You could use Burke for this. You could use Oakeshott even to saying that to distribute welfare and stuff like that. Okay. Remember when you're doing all of that to talk about to connect the state to ideas about their human nature and to take it back a little bit to get more analysis points. Okay, so the new right. They think the state should be limited to a night watchman state. That is purely to protect against violence and property rights. They believe that the economy should be left laissez-faire, so it should be left alone. The state should not get involved in the economy as much as possible, and that taxation should be minimal, so that should say. and they totally reject the idea of paternalism, so they reject the idea of welfare. And for this, you could use Rand or Nozick or any of those things that we previously went through. Okay, quite an easy essay, brilliant if you get that one. Okay, conservatism and human nature. A little bit less to talk about here in terms of agreement, okay, but there is some stuff with agreement. So they agree on, they all agree that human nature is fixed, okay, like the first slide. They disagree on what is fixed, but most conservatives agree that capitalism actually suits our nature. So whether you are a one nation, traditional, or new right, it's usually you think capitalism matches quite well with our human nature in some way or another. That humans have different abilities and talents. They believe this is natural, and forcing equality is artificial. So they would all reject kind of socialist claims about human nature. So what don't they agree on? Well, one nation traditional conservatives, they think human nature is fixed negatively, in that we are morally, psychologically, and intellectually flawed. Particularly Hobbes here. You can talk about Hobbes and the fact that we will revert to a state against state of nature, a war of all against all, etc. Or Oakeshott, sorry, who talks about that we can that we're not rational, that we can't think of these ideologies because we can't really, and if we do, that tends to lead towards tyranny, etc. In a particular, we should submit to a strong state to avoid the state of nature. I've mentioned that already. Nature means that we must live in a hierarchy, that we should be respect, etc., etc. Okay, so everyone should kind of know their place. Okay, new right and libertarians. Humans are rational and should be free from interference. Don't know why this is bold, but it is. So that's quite different. So they think that humans kind of, in a sense, should be left to pursue their own desires. Capitalism definitely suits our rationality. So Ayn Rand called herself a radical for capitalism. There is a contradiction here, though. Neoconservatives do not trust rational people to choose their own lifestyles in particular areas. Okay, so what if you think that human beings are rational and capable of making their own choices? Why ban? Well, why essentially keep gay marriage illegal, which they did, which I have to say a Conservative Prime Minister overturned. So David Cameron overturned that, or rather made it legal. But why have Section 28, which bans the promotion of homosexuality in schools? If you think that humans are rational and can choose their own destinies, then surely whatever you put in front of them is fine, isn't it? So there's a bit of a contradiction between the new right trusts people economically, doesn't necessarily trust them socially. So that's a bit of a contradiction, but if you point that out, that's fine. Okay, to finish off this video, conservatives therefore can protect the status quo, or in the late 20th century be quite a radical philosophy promoting extreme individualism. Thatcher probably stirred up our political landscape and our economy and Britain as a whole, socially, everything, more than any other prime minister since the Second World War. And so that's worth thinking that she's a conservative. So people often describe her as a revolutionary, whatever. Yet within this tension between those who want to preserve tradition and those who want a more radical sort of form of things, the political parties around the world seem to hold together under this banner of conservatism, or this idea. So it seems to hold, like the Republican Party in the United States is a very old party. The Conservative Party in England, lots of political parties around the world still coalesce under this banner of being conservative. So it seems to have some sort of enduring quality. All right. Thank you for listening, watching, etc.